The Radio Astronomy Observatory was a few miles outside Cambridge. Radio observatories need to be rural because of radio interference. Things that spark, give radio waves. So you don't want to be in an urban area where there's a lot of electrical equipment that could produce spurious radio waves. The observatory had actually been, during the war, a bomb testing site. There were a number of bunkers. Slightly earlier on, there had been some cases of nasty nerve gases getting turned up, horses keeling over as they ploughed. But by the time I got there, I think all that had gone. I'm Jocelyn Bell Burnell. I'm a British astronomer, and I'm currently working in the University of Oxford. So I went to Cambridge in 1965 to start a PhD in radio astronomy. And I opted to work with Tony Hewish as my supervisor because he had a plan to find more quasars. At that stage, quasars were the really sexy things. There were probably only about 20 of them known. They were known to be very distant. They were known to be some of the most powerful radio sources we could detect. And how you reconciled those two statements was a complete puzzle, which was part of the fascination. I started work in the summer as a summer intern and spent the summer building a prototype radio telescope to check out some things. Then, come the beginning of the academic year, we start construction of this huge radio telescope. Covered an area of like 57 tennis courts. It's really, really big. Thousands of wooden posts to be hammered into the ground and wire strung up between the posts. I was spared most of the hammering, but I did enough that I could swing a sledgehammer by the end of my PhD. Not one of the normal qualifications of a PhD. My main responsibility was all the plugs, sockets, connections. So I did all the cabling and connectors and so on. And it wasn't a steerable dish or mirror type thing. We scanned the sky by allowing the Earth to rotate under the sky. And it took about 6 of us 2 years to build this radio telescope. It wasn't until my final year that the telescope was built and I was given responsibility for operating it. And the work really involved going out to the observatory each day, resetting the telescope for the next 24 hours observing, picking up the rolls of paper chart, because at that time, University of Cambridge had just one computer. It took up a whole room and it had memory comparable to a poor laptop. So I didn't have access to that computer. My data was purely analogue on these rolls and rolls and rolls of paper chart. Sometimes when we go to a hospital for tests, maybe they're monitoring our heart, and the data comes out on strips of paper. I had kilometres of the stuff by the end of the year. My project was to find more quasars. And the technique was, because the quasars are very compact, they're massive but very compact. Because they're compact, they will twinkle. So looking for twinkling objects in the radio is a neat way of creaming out the quasars. At the time we started, there were about 20 quasars known, and I found, about 180, so I was quite pleased with that. And after a couple of years building the radio telescope and analysing kilometres of paper chart by hand, I inadvertently discovered pulsars. I was monitoring the universe for things that varied, for things that changed brightness. We didn't expect things that went regularly beep, 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 beep. Whoa. Initially, I nicknamed this signal LGM, standing for Little Green Men. Fairly soon, I found a second and a third and a fourth. And it's very unlikely there are 4 lots of little green men, different parts of the universe, all independently deciding to signal to planet Earth, all happening to use our radio band. It just doesn't wash. It's got to be some natural or barely natural kind of source. It's not artificial. I started life in the north of Ireland. My family are a Quaker family. Quakerism is a very open religion. Look for light understanding everywhere, wherever you can find it. So it's not scared of scientific discoveries the way some religions are. So it's produced a lot of scientists. It's a very small church, but it's produced a lot of scientists. It was fairly soon after the Second World War. Women had worked during the Second World War while the men were at the front, but as the men came home from the war, women were encouraged to be stay-at-home wives and mothers, without much aspiration beyond running a good house and keeping husband happy. However, my family were keen that the girls as well as the boys had a good education, and I think my father in particular recognised that I had some scientific bent. He was an architect, and sometimes he would take me along when he was visiting a site for a new building to help with the surveying of the site, which meant I got to stand in a bed of stinging nettles holding a pole while he read the altitudes on the various parts of the site. And then, going home in the car afterwards, he'd let me reduce the observations. One of the places where my father was architect was the Armagh Observatory. And at the time I first went there with him, there was just the old building and some telescope domes. And quite a lot of Dad's job was finding the leaks in the roof. So I teased the Armagh astronomers that I know their roof space better than they do. But ultimately they decided to build a planetarium, and my father was the architect for that. And I can remember visiting the site as the planetarium grew. I had a battle to get to do science at school. The convention was that the girls did cookery and needlework and the boys did science. And I was very disappointed in this, as my parents had told me I'd get to do science when I got into the senior school. I tried remonstrating with the domestic science teacher, but she wasn't hearing anything of it. My parents phoned the head teacher that evening and said, "Jocelyn is going to do science." And the next time the science class met, there were 3 girls and all the boys. And I think we were the first girls to do science in that school. We did physics that first term, and I loved it, and I came top of the class. The teacher berated the boys for allowing a girl to beat them. I don't remember him saying anything to me. But a few years later, in that same science class, we were doing what is called circular motion. A body is going round in a circle, and we're studying the forces on it. And at the same time, at home, I was reading a book, one that my father had actually brought home from the library, by Fred Hoyle, Frontiers of Astronomy. And Fred Hoyle is writing about these big galaxies of stars rotating. And here at school, I'm learning about things rotating. And I suddenly realised that the physics that I'm learning at school can be applied to astrophysics. And what a subject. So I decided I was going to be an astronomer or an astrophysicist. So I've finished my bachelor's degree. I'm age about 22, and I'm heading away to the deep south of England, to Cambridge, to start a PhD in radio astronomy. Early in my 3rd year, my final year, the telescope is now at last built and operating, and I'm collecting these rolls of paper, miles and miles and miles of paper chart. lovely red lines over turquoise chart markings. And I'm looking for things that twinkle, the quasars. I also, of course, pick up a lot of radio interference because it's a huge radio telescope, very sensitive, and I get used to identifying interference. But I notice that occasionally there's a signal that doesn't look like interference and doesn't look like a quasar. And the first few times I log it with a question mark and pass on because there's miles of these paper charts to be analysed. And then by about the third or the fourth sighting, my brain says, "You've seen funny signal like this before, haven't you? You've seen funny signal like this before from this bit of the sky, haven't you?" So I get out the shoebox, rolled up rolls of chart paper that cover that strip of sky, spread them out on the floor. And yes, just occasionally, not always, but just occasionally, there's this curious signal from this same bit of sky. And at that point, I go and talk to Tony, my thesis advisor, and say, "Tony, there's a signal here that I can't make sense of. It doesn't look like interference. It doesn't look like a quasar. What do you think it is?" And he didn't know, but he rightly observed, "Look, this whole signal is jammed into a 1/4 inch of chart paper. We can't really see what's going on. We need an enlargement." And with chart recordings, rolls of chart paper, the way you get an enlargement is to run the paper faster under the pen and everything gets spread out. But we can't leave it running at that faster rate because it'll get through a complete roll of paper in 20 minutes. So the grad student, Jocelyn, has to go out to the observatory a few minutes before the telescope is looking at that bit of sky, switch to a high-speed recording, let it run, and then after 5 or 10 minutes switch back to the normal survey and let the survey carry on. And I did that faithfully for a month, and the signal, whatever it was, had gone away. And Tony was cross, "Trust a grad student, you've gone and messed up, it's all your fault." And then finally, after about a month of this, one day, I got it. And it turned out to be a string of pulses. The thing, whatever it was going bleep, 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 at a very steady rate. And I hadn't a clue what this was. I contacted Tony. He was back in Cambridge in the university, I think teaching in an undergraduate laboratory, and he came to the phone a bit annoyed and said, "Oh, it's interference." Now, I knew it wasn't because it was keeping its place amongst the stars. It's getting 4 minutes earlier every day. And typically interference keeps to the 24-hour day, not the 23-hour, 56-minute day that the stars keep to. But anyway, Tony came out to the observatory the next day at the appropriate time and stood looking over my shoulder to see what I was doing wrong as I set up for the observation. And it was really scary because this signal had been absent for a month. It had appeared yesterday. Was it going to appear a second day? It did, and it pulsed again. Cambridge was very short of women and very full of young men who were absolutely confident in their abilities and very happy to tell you about their abilities. They had come from expensive schools. They considered they had a right to be in Cambridge, and I didn't. I actually thought they'd made a mistake admitting me, that I wasn't clever enough, that they'd discover their mistake and throw me out. We now have a name for this. It's called imposter syndrome. And it's when somebody from a maybe less conventional background turns up at one of these expensive places. If we're not careful, the student will say, everybody here is very clever. I'm not. They're going to discover their mistake and throw me out. And we have to watch new students that they don't feel that and decide to take themselves off home before the term has even started. But at that time, it wasn't even named. But I can see with hindsight, I was suffering from that. My way to cope with that was to say, right, they are going to throw me out at some point because they've made a mistake. But I'm not going to walk out of my own accord. Instead, I will work my very hardest so that when they throw me out, I'll know I've done my best and I just wasn't clever enough for this place. So I was working very, very hard. Part of my approach was to be really, really thorough, and that's why I took seriously that curious signal and really wanted to understand what it was. I was instructed to keep doing these observations, and we enlisted the help of some colleagues who had a separate radio telescope at the observatory with its own receivers and things, and asked them to see if they could pick up this funny signal. Robin was the student on that, Paul Scott, his advisor, and the four of us clustered round Robin's pen recorder at the appropriate time, and nothing happened. And the two academics, Tony and Paul, started walking down this long lab saying, what could it be that shows in your telescope but not in ours? Could it be da-da-da-da? No, it can't be that because da-da-da. Well, what about, no, that won't work. No. And I was padding along behind them. Robin stayed by his pen recorder, and we got down the end of this long lab and there was a shriek from Robin, here it is! And we came racing back up the lab, and there it was. A pulsing signal, just like I was picking up with my radio telescope. And that was such a relief because Tony really thought I was messing up somehow. The pulses were quite steep-sided, quite sharp pulses, which immediately gives you a conundrum. The steady pulse rate suggests the thing has lots of energy reserves. It's not getting tired. It's not slowing down. But the steep-sided pulses suggests it's small. So it's small, but it's got big energy reserves. Doesn't make sense. So it turns out that what I was detecting was the first four pulsars. Pulsar is an abbreviation of pulsating radio star because it pulses, or it appears to pulse. It appears to pulse because it's got a beam of radio waves that it swings round the sky, a bit like a lighthouse swings a beam of light round the sky. Every time the lighthouse beam shines in your eyes, you see a pulse. Every time a pulsar shines a beam of radio waves on your radio telescope, you pick up a pulse. We now understand that pulsars are neutron stars. These were the cores of big stars which dramatically exploded in what we call a supernova explosion. And the central part of the star gets very highly compressed, going down from about the size and mass of the Sun to the mass of the Sun in a ball that's about 10 kilometres radius. So very, very dense. These things are rich in neutrons, the neutral particles that we find in the nucleus of the atom. They're rich in neutrons, so they've become known as neutron stars. At that stage, I don't think neutron stars were widely known about or very much believed either. It was one of the kind of crazy ideas that some theoreticians might have come up with, along with things like black holes. The current catalogue of pulsars probably has about 5,000 pulsars in it, all in our galaxy, plus one or two in the Magellanic Clouds. But basically, at the moment, our telescopes aren't strong enough to pick up pulsars in external galaxies. They'll be there, but we can't detect them. In the paper announcing the discovery. We published the first one and said we've got several more, so you'd better believe us, guys. And a day or two before Nature publishes this paper, Tony gives a colloquium in Cambridge, and everybody in Cambridge came. And Tony describes what we found and concludes by giving his favourite model, which is that it's a white dwarf. Sitting in the front row in the colloquium is Fred Hoyle. And Fred is the first to speak when Tony finishes. And Fred says in his best Yorkshire accent, "I don't think it's a white dwarf. I think it's a supernova remnant." Supernova being one of these big stars that explodes, and we now know leaves a neutron star or pulsar in its middle. So Fred, within 40 minutes, not knowing anything about this to begin with, follows the whole story and hits the right explanation in one. He was an amazing astrophysicist. I was working part-time. I had a support role in an X-ray astronomy laboratory, the Mullard Space Science Lab. And I'm been recruited to look after one of the lab's experiments on the satellite. And it's the day the satellite is launching. We come in to work early because the launch is about 8 a.m. and we have an audio link. And we all sit there and we hear the countdown, and we hear the launch and the separation of the stages, and it all seems to be going fantastically well. And just after noon, a colleague comes roaring into my office. "Have you heard the news? Have you heard the news?" And I went, "Oh my God, the satellite's failed." Because I'd be out of a job if it had. But it wasn't. It was the announcement of the Nobel Prize. The Nobel Physics Prize, which was shared jointly by two Cambridge radio astronomers, Martin Ryle, the head of group, and Tony Hewish, my ex-supervisor. Martin for his work on developing radio telescopes and surveying the sky, and Tony for the discovery of pulsars. And my colleague expects me to be very angry. But I'm not, because I realise immediately this is the first time the Physics Nobel Prize has gone to any astronomers. This is a milestone. This is a precedent. Other astronomers are going to walk through that door in the future. And other astronomers have indeed walked through the door in the future. I wasn't cross. I was actually rather pleased that at last the Nobel Physics Committee had seen the light. So one of the consequences of not getting a Nobel Prize is you get every other prize that moves. And actually, I think that's better. The biggest prize I've had is the Breakthrough Prize, $3 million. And I decided that I would donate that money to the UK's Institute of Physics to create studentships for people who were from minority groups to do research in physics. One of the reasons I discovered pulsars was I was working very hard because I felt an outsider. And I thought, if more outsiders are given the chance to do physics research, maybe they too will work hard and come with fresh eyes and make fresh discoveries. One of the spin-offs, if I can pun a bit, from the discovery of pulsars and recognising that they were neutron stars was that it made black holes seem more plausible, but it was probably another 5 or 6 years before the X-ray astronomers really proved that we had black holes. We now understand quasars to be, yes, very, very distant objects. They have mass like a galaxy, 100,000 million stars, but a lot of that is compressed into a black hole. They have massive black holes in their centres of about 1 million times the mass of the Sun. So they're much, much bigger things than these pulsars. As telescopes have got bigger and better, we no longer need to take long exposures in order to see things. We can take short exposures. And if you take a whole string of short exposures, you might discover that the thing's blinking or bursting or hiccuping, that it's not steady. And so we are finding a lot of phenomena now, not just in radio astronomy, at many wavelengths, of things that are highly variable on quite short timescales. And one of the most interesting ones was discovered accidentally by pulsar astronomers. There are some things as yet not understood, typically way beyond our own galaxy, in some other galaxy, which produce a short, sharp pulse of radio waves, a single pulse. We now call them fast radio bursts, and they are currently one of the most amazing and the most puzzling objects, I think, that is around. One of the sort of turning points for me was I was invited to go to Boston to speak at what was known as the Texas Symposium, to do the after-dinner speech. And I told the story a bit like I've told it today, and finish. I'm wearing a very long, straight skirt, and I have to get down the steps from the platform without falling on my face. And I'm busy negotiating these steps. There's thunderous applause, and I suddenly realise everyone's standing to applaud.